Despite his men's uncertainty, they choose to put their faith in their king and go about preparations, choosing a swampy battlefield to meet the English on and constructing large ditches filled with sharpened stakes to surprise the English heavy cavalry. The movie begins in 1304, outside the besieged Stirling Castle in Scotland. King Edward of England was appointed to choose the Scottish heir when the Scottish king died, but instead, he seized power and brutally occupied the country. The Scots rebelled, led by Sir William Wallace, but he was defeated at the Battle of Falkirk and went into hiding, leaving the English with the upper hand in the fight against their northern neighbours' attempt at independence. Many Scottish lords decided to submit again to English rule with no other choice. Robert Bruce, his rival John Comyn, and other Scottish nobility reluctantly swear allegiance to King Edward of England. Their lands confiscated during their revolution are now returned to the lords. King Edward appointed a viceroy to lead a new council of Scottish administration, whom Robert and John would serve under. As the noblemen begin to depart, Robert is challenged to a friendly duel by the English king's son, Edward II, whom he half-heartedly fights. The duel is stopped when the prince is summoned by his father to answer the petitioner's requests. When one Scotsman, James Douglas, petitions the king to return his family's lands and titles, Edward I refuses because his father was a traitor. All are then invited to watch as Edward I seals the treaty with the Scots by launching Greek fire at the nearby castle and telling his commanders to accept the fortress's surrender. During the evening feast, the king gives Robert the hand of Elizabeth de Burgh, an Irish noblewoman whose father is a close friend and ally to Edward I. With Robert Sr.'s encouragement, Robert half-heartedly accepts. His father tells him that having the king's favor is essential, and he believes that he will eventually be offered the crown as promised by the king. Back home, Robert and his father deal with the realities of their submission, and Elizabeth soon arrives. They are introduced to each by the prince, and she warmly greets Robert's daughter, Marjorie, who introduces her to Jessie, her dog. Soon after, they are officially married, but Robert respectfully delays the consummation. As the months go by, Elizabeth slowly begins to warm up to Robert and Marjorie while the strain of England's rule takes its toll on the common folk, as they must compensate for the rebellion. The king's men arrive to find men who can fight, as they are obliged by their agreement with him. A soldier grabs a young boy as his mother protests that he is yet of age to fight. Elizabeth uses her title to stop them from taking the young boy. One night, Robert's father recounted stories from his youth when he fought alongside King Edward in the Crusades and, despite believing him to be a friend, ultimately regrets trusting him. Robert's father then passes away shortly afterward, making him the new Lord of Annandale. Sometime later, in 1305, Robert and his men traveled to the border city of Berwick to deliver taxes owed to England. After doing so, Robert and his men are swept up in a mob who've gathered in the marketplace to view the arm of William Wallace, having finally been caught and hanged, drawn, and quartered. Violence erupts as the people begin to shout and threaten the English soldiers. Robert watches in horror as the English begin cutting down Scottish commoners, trying to defend themselves. Returning to his home, Robert tells his brothers the news of Wallace's execution and his renewed desire to cast off English rule again. They agree, and so does Elizabeth, who had eavesdropped in their conversation. Soon, Robert meets Comyn in a church to try and get his support, but the two exchange tense words. When Comyn shares his intention of informing King Edward of his plans, Robert draws Comyn's knife from his belt and stabs him in the neck, killing him at the altar. Afterward, Robert confesses the murder to the Scottish clergy, who offer him a pardon if he supports the Catholic Church in Scotland. They will help him as King of Scotland and lead the country against the English. Robert accepts the offer and will be crowned king in the village of Scone. In England, Edward I receives word of Comyn's murder and Robert's crowning, infuriating him. Prince Edward II pleads with his father to let him prove himself by killing or capturing Robert, and the king reluctantly agrees. Meanwhile, Robert decides to call together the Scottish nobles and make his case for a second attempt at independence. While some nobles side with him, Comyn's supporters refuse. On their way to Scone, Robert encounters James Douglas, who pledges his service to Robert in exchange for the promise that his family's lands and titles will be returned to him. While King Edward knights hundreds of men to accompany his son, ordering them to ride under the dragon's banner, Robert is crowned King of Scots. Later, Robert meets in the field with De Valence, brother-in-law to Comyn, who tries to move against Robert before the prince arrives. To avoid bloodshed, he challenges De Valence to single combat, who accepts but delays the duel a day, as it is Sunday. That night, the Scots celebrate and prepare themselves for battle in a nearby forest. After Robert and Elizabeth share a quiet moment, they passionately consummate their marriage. Afterward, they put Marjorie to bed. Robert makes Elizabeth promise that no matter what happens to him, she will protect his daughter. Hearing strange noises outside their tent, Robert investigates, and volleys of fire arrows rained down on the Scottish camp. De Valence, choosing not to hold to their agreement, moved his forces into range and attacked under darkness. As the English continue their attack, Robert entrusts his brother Neil to escort Elizabeth and Marjorie to Kildrummy Castle and seek refuge with Lord Fraser, a friend and ally. Despite fierce resistance, Robert has escaped the inevitable defeat and runs with only about 50 of his men still alive. Beaten, bloodied, and desperate, Robert and his men aimlessly wander the Scottish countryside, eventually deciding to make for the home islands of one of his allies, Angus MacDonald, hoping to replenish his forces. Along the way, John MacDougall encounters them, bitter about the murder of his cousin Cummin, but allows them to pass by unharmed. Elsewhere, Neil brings Elizabeth and Marjorie to Lord Fraser's castle, finding some rest from the quickly deteriorating situation Robert's crowning has created. When Robert and his men come to a river, they attempt to cross, only to be ambushed by the MacDougalls. In the skirmish, Robert's brother, Alexander, is impaled by a spear, and his body is left behind as the outlaw king's forces dwindle further. Eventually, finding their way to the islands, the small group of soldiers rest and recover, and those who can pledge to join his forces. Meanwhile, Prince Edward cuts a bloody path through Scotland, mercilessly killing Robert's supporters and pillaging or capturing towns and villages, including Robert's castle. When he arrives at Perth, he berates De Valence for letting the outlaw escape and his ineptitude in tracking him down. Shortly after, a loyal Scottish nobleman arrives and informs the English of the whereabouts of Elizabeth and Marjorie, and the prince gathers his men to confront Lord Fraser. Arriving at Kildrummy, the prince commands Lord Fraser to hand over Robert's wife and daughter, or they will attack. While Fraser buys some time by claiming ignorance of their whereabouts, Neil sneaks Elizabeth and Marjorie outside the walls, telling them to wait and hide in the forest until he can send men to protect them and spirit them away. After unleashing a hail of fire arrows into the castle, Lord Fraser offers to open the gates and allow the English entry. When both Neil and Lord Fraser continue to claim that Elizabeth and Marjorie are not there, Prince Edward signals his men to approach to show that they've already captured them. Unhappy with their defiance, the prince orders Neil to be hanged from the castle gates and is subsequently disemboweled in front of Elizabeth and Marjorie. He slits Lord Fraser's throat and orders Robert's wife and daughter to be returned to England as hostages. On the island, Robert is informed of Neil's execution and his family's capture. With the desire for revenge burning, the outlaw king returns to the mainland. He continues to gather resources and allies, eventually concluding that fighting the English head-on will only result in defeat as his forces are still dwarfed by their enemy. The Scots decided to launch a campaign of guerrilla warfare, striking English fortifications in small groups and taking the enemy by surprise. After defeating the garrison at his castle and setting it ablaze, Robert allows James Douglas to take a handful of men to do the same. Soon, Douglas infiltrates his family's castle on Palm Sunday. During Mass, when most of the English garrison is praying inside the church, he repeatedly veils himself and chants Douglas. As his men brutally kill their enemies and set fire to the castle before gathering supporters for his cause and rejoining Robert. Meanwhile, King Edward I continues to become increasingly aware of his frailty and failing health. In England, Marjorie is taken away by a nun to serve as a glorified hostage at a convent. At the same time, Elizabeth's parents are brought to her and with her. Prince Edward II attempts to convince her to sign a document that forsakes Robert, annuls their marriage, and pardons her for her crimes against the crown. When Elizabeth refuses to sign it and laughs at the prince for his continued inability to capture her husband, she's thrown in a metal cage and suspended over the walls. When he receives word of another raid by Robert's forces, King Edward becomes angered. He decides to muster his army and lead them into Scotland himself, intent on personally ending the rebellion as he had when he defeated William Wallace at Falkirk almost a decade prior. On the march, King Edward I faints and, on his deathbed, instructs his son to boil his body and carry his bones to every battle he fights against the Scottish. As the king succumbs to dysentery, the prince's final words to his father do not love as he mocks him and claims that his father treated him so poorly because he knew his son was much stronger than himself and was afraid of that strength. Before leaving his dead father's tent, Edward II instructs his men to bury the late king's body there and now, despite his last request. As the English draw closer and closer, Robert decides to finally meet them in a pitched battle rather than continue to run and hide. Despite his men's uncertainty, they choose to put their faith in their king and go about preparations, choosing a swampy battlefield to meet the English on and constructing large ditches filled with sharpened stakes to surprise the English heavy cavalry. Later, James Douglas is tasked with intercepting the prince and offering them battle at the designated spot. The two forces meet on the field the next day, the English numbering in the thousands while Robert's army is barely above 500 strong. Eager to prove himself and secure his position as the new King of England, Edward II orders De Valence and many heavy cavalries to charge Robert's waiting army. The English see the trap set for them too late, and as both horses and knights fall victim to the stake-lined pits, a brutal muddy battle ensues. Even after Edward II himself enters the war with the remainder of his men, the Scots continue to cut down Englishmen and soon send them running to retreat. Once more, Robert and Edward II duel, with the former emerging victorious. Battered and begging for help, Edward II is spared by Robert and allowed to retreat with what's left of his army as the Scottish king claims his first major victory against the English. James Douglas would earn the nickname the Black Douglas and earn his family's lands back, while Angus MacDonald would be made Lord of the Isles. Edward II would return to England and be made king, only to be murdered by his nobles years later. The movie ends as Elizabeth is eventually set free in a prisoner exchange and rejoins Robert and Marjorie, and 300 years later, one of Robert's descendants, James VI, would be crowned King of Scotland and England. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more videos like this to help the channel out. Have a nice day.